I'm making an escape room game where one of the puzzles takes place at an art museum. The problem is, it has no art in it. I could use art I've made before, but I want the style to all be the same. That's when I got the idea to use old famous paintings from artists like Van Gogh or Cezanne. They're old enough that they're in the public domain, and they all have a similar look. Now the problem became that their style doesn't really match the style of the game. That's when I started messing around with GIMP's filters and downscaling, and now I can turn this into this in like 10 seconds. Or with a bit more time, I can turn it into something like this, which I think looks a lot better and is more unique. Before I explain how, I'll show a couple more examples, all with art from Van Gogh. So here we see the original on the left, and then next to that is how it would look if you only downscaled it. Then to the right of that is the filtered downscale method I'll be showing, and then finally at the end is a more in-depth version of that with a few more filters and some manual touch-ups. And here's another just like it, but this time with a building instead of a person. And if you want to use any of the ones I've shown for your own projects, there'll be an Imgur album in the description where you can find them. The first thing you want to do is paste your image into GIMP or whatever your editing software of choice is. The steps might not be named the same thing for every program, but it should be pretty close. Then you go to Filters, Artistic, Water Pixels. This basically divides your image up into regions with similar color values. The top setting is how big of an area the values will morph to, so a low number will make it look more like the original, while a high number will simplify it more and more. Generally, you're going to want to keep this in the 30 to 60 range though. Gradient smoothness is basically how irregularly shaped the borders can be. I found that the values for this don't really matter much, but I would keep it in the 1 to 3 range. And then our bottom setting is how regularly shaped the region is. This you usually just want to leave at 0. The next thing you're going to do is scale it down, and by how much really depends on what it is and how many details you want to keep. I found that there's 3 sizes though that work for basically anything. 5 times, 10 times, or 20 times. A person, for example, might look too blurry at 20 times, but look good at 10 times. After scaling it down, you just scale it back up by the same multiple, and the result is a pixelated form of the original piece. Now this is where you could stop, and like I mentioned earlier, you can do that all in about 10 seconds once you're used to it, but it's not too much work to improve it further. Usually the first thing I'll do at this point is re-downscale it and do some manual touch-ups. Sometimes borders end up looking a little weird, and sometimes you lose out on details you wanted, or you keep details you didn't want. For now we're going to keep it small and increase the contrast a little. A lower resolution means we have less details like highlights and shadows, so this makes the piece a bit more dynamic. Then I duplicate the layer, and on a new layer I add dithering by going to Colors, Dither. The first thing you're going to want to do here is set the dithering method to Bayer. Then for colors, what I do is pick one part that I want to stand out. So here I'll choose the reds, which will mostly affect his face and ears. I set the blue and green values really high so that they're not noticeable, and then I set the red value to something low so the pixels are really clear. Then I erase everything in the background, which has 2 purposes. Firstly, it removes dithering from the background, which we want because that's not our focus, so adding more details to it doesn't really matter. And then it also lets us add a drop shadow to this layer, which is a really easy way to add some depth. Then I combine the 2 layers, and at this point you're basically done. If you want to compare it to the original, enlarge it again by the same multiple, and sometimes side by side it's easier to notice things you want to change. A couple of things I'll commonly do at this point is use the color dodge tool to emphasize something, or hue shift the skin tones to warm them up. Pretty easy, pretty simple, and the outcome isn't really like anything I've seen before. Especially for things like portraits and background art, it can be a massive time saver if you just find public domain art and make it your own by doing this. I have a few other pixel art videos if you like this one, and if you end up liking those 2, you should subscribe so you can see them when they come out. But that's all for now. Peace.